I'll go ahead and get started. Just so our speaker has her full time. The idea is that she would speak to roughly till about 12:45 or so, and then there'll be a time of question and answer that she can direct. Or I'll help her if you'd like to chat. But in case you don't know me, my name is Don Isaac, and I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Research and Grants. And it's my privilege to host this sabbatical presentation and to introduce our speaker, Dr. Regina Trammel, who's an associate professor in the Master of Social Work program. And I know you were already alerted to this, but I just want to remind you that the presentation is recorded for posting on the ORG YouTube channel. And the link to that channel, Yvonne will send it to the Provost newsletter here in an upcoming issue. So we're ready to provide that. And it really gives Regina a chance to, or Dr. Trammel a chance to multiply her time here, because we do get quite a few views on that. Dr. Trammel has a BA in psychology from Occidental College, a Master of Social Work from the University of Central Florida, and a Ph.D. in social work from Baylor. APU's own Dr. Paul Kack was a member of her doctoral committee while she was at Baylor, through Baylor. And her dissertation, titled Christian-Informed Mindfulness, a Theoretical and Empirical Exploration, certainly hints at the contribution that she has made to mindfulness, both before and after her dissertation. Indeed, Dr. Trammel, she has several contributions, including a published book chapter, several journal articles on mindfulness, as well as having given multiple presentations, many that are invited as well as otherwise. And she was also one of the invited speakers to the TEDx conference that APU hosted in 2017, in which she spoke on using mindfulness to deal with everyday pressures. And just recently, her new book, co-authored with APU's writing consultant, John Trent, which is titled A Counselor's Guide to Christian Mindfulness, Engaging the Mind, Body, and Soul in Biblical Practices and Therapies, was published by Zondervan. And there's a real nice overview of this new book in the Zondervan academic website. I recommend you go to that website and read the overview, in addition to the book, of course. The website has one inaccuracy, though. It labels Dr. Trammel as an assistant rather than an associate professor. So they need to update that. But the write-up also that they give reminds us of Dr. Trammel's experience beyond academia, as it points out her other work earlier on as a psychotherapist in the Chicago area, and the fact that she's a licensed clinical social worker with expertise on treating depression, anxiety, and sexual abuse trauma. And just an aside, I would really encourage you also to look at Dr. Trammel's CV on the APU website, because it is one of the few faculty CVs on APU's website that's up to date. And so today she will be speaking on A Counselor's Guide to Christian Mindfulness, Research and Practices. And in this talk, she'll be giving some insights into the book I just brought up. So I'll just go ahead and turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Don, for that wonderful and cherished introduction. And I just want to say at the outset, I have a lot of people to thank. First and foremost, I just want to thank my chair who's on this call, Dr. Mary Rawlings, for her support throughout this project, from just even her mentorship in terms of helping me craft out this sort of research agenda that I've continued to follow, and to the Dean of Bass for supporting this effort, as well as the Provost's office for funding the sabbatical, which allowed me to be able to complete this book project. And then a special thank you to your office, Dawn, for providing and advocating for those continued writers' retreats in Malibu. Those were very key for me in being able to complete a book proposal, which itself was about 60 pages long. And just to have that space is really important. And then last but not least, Dr. Marcia Fowler was really key in creating a weekly supportive writing space for faculty, and with her wealth of information, really helped me conceptualize kind of the theological underpinnings of my dissertation as well as this book project. And then Dr. Paul Kack's office as well, who again was supportive in helping me think about faith integration, right? And spiritual formation, which I think is embedded in this work. So it takes a village. And so I would be remiss to, not acknowledge the support of APU itself for this book project. And I tried to honor that in the book as well throughout. So I wanted to start out saying that at the get-go. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so you all can follow along with me. The benefit of sharing the screen is then you have some information, and the detriment of sharing screen is that we don't have our faces to interact, right? So, but let me know. I'm always willing to kind of, if you have a question, feel free to jump in, and then I will absolutely stop sharing screen in order to be able to attend to that question. So hopefully you're seeing that. Let me see if I can get this into presentation view. Here we go. So this is the cover. I can't take any credit for its design. I think it's beautiful. There was a great design team at Zondervan of the book. And again, the focus of this book was, really being able to encapsulate my work, not only in terms of mindfulness for in terms of research, but bringing it down to the level of the practitioner, because in social work particular, and psychologists and counselors, we do often work in high stress environments. So I wanted to write a book that really addressed not only the client participant level of engagement, but also deal with things like burnout, which is often the case for those of us working in the mental health. Obviously, a lot of you are probably hearing more about that as a result of COVID and post-COVID. So the other rationale, I just want to say on a personal note, when I was a psychotherapist, mindfulness was starting to come into the discussion, and a lot of that mindfulness training that I received really did leave out kind of the Christian stream of contemplative practice. And so so what we find in mindfulness, particularly in these sort of third wave behavioral models, I didn't spell out all the different interventions, but third wave behaviorist theoretical models include things like dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive theory. These are really grounded in secular and or Buddhist frameworks. In fact, I would actually call it Buddhist light. And I talk a little bit about that in my book, but I think the Christian framework for training and usage of mindfulness is just starting to have some more momentum. I've done some work in this area. There's a lot of other folks in CCUC type schools who are also doing this work. And so I think this book project fills a gap to help bring down some of the research that I've done and that others have done in this area in terms of mindfulness from a Christian stream to be very practical, so that practitioners in social work, psychology, counseling, MFT fields can use this kind of title in their work with clients. So just a general overview for this talk, I want to help define Christian mindfulness and distinguish the practice from secular and Buddhist models of mindfulness, and then share with you a little bit about how Christian mindfulness works in direct practice. I can even, if you're willing, lead you through some of those really short, brief practices. And then I want to help you understand the research base around Christian mindfulness practice, and how you might want to incorporate that into third wave behavioral interventions. And then again, advance your own self-care practices through mindfulness. And then additional note is that I also, during the sabbatical, alongside writing this book, I did complete a study on pastors and mindfulness and the potential of the use of Christian mindfulness for their own issues of burnout in ministry. So when we think about mindfulness in general, that we really have to look to Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn. He's a Boston, he works and teaches mindfulness in General Massachusetts Hospital in Boston. And what he did was studied Zen Buddhism and kind of secularized and operationalized mindfulness. Mindfulness is, according to him and his definition, is a practice of paying attention on purpose with non-judgment. And a lot of this definition has some underpinnings to particularly the Mahayana tradition of Buddhist thought. And so that is some of the theoretical work I've done and put in the book so that people understand where some of these things come from. So again, mindfulness is often defined in the practice and research literature in this way. And then there's some other research regarding state versus trait mindfulness, which I won't get into too much for the sake of time, but there is the difference between what we considered mindfulness state and how we measure that versus mindfulness trait, which is more steady in terms of more permanent type of mindfulness that some researchers look at. So in Buddhism, where mindfulness comes from is in the Fourth Noble Truth. So Buddhist religious worldview really comes from a lot of these scripts in the Pali and some of the Eastern Mahayana tradition, which I'll be focusing my talk on. But that really that all life is suffering. So this idea of dukkha, which comes from some of the Hindu texts, and that suffering is caused by your cravings in life, that there's a truth of impermanence in life according to Buddhism, and therefore detachment to cravings and seeing that we are all one will end this suffering. So part of getting to enlightenment is understanding these four truths, and part of that fourth truth is an eightfold path. And one of those 8 paths is right mindfulness. So mindfulness being, again, kind of this paying attention to attachment, paying attention to understanding that there is suffering, and then looking at things like right action, right behavior, and some of the ethics that are housed in Buddhism. What's different for Christians, obviously, is that we don't draw our understanding from the Buddhist text, but we do have a historical tradition in the contemplative and mystical traditions of mindfulness that kind of predate the Reformation. That's congruent with what we would term mindfulness in the Jon Kabat-Zinn's operational definition. So whether that's state or trait, that there's a lot of thought and theory regarding Christian contemplative and spiritual direction practices that can elicit state and trait. So for instance, Rosales and Tan, I just want to give a shout out to Sung-Young Tan, who's also been a mentor of mine, and he has done some of this work and thinking about how present moment orientation allows for the Holy Spirit, right, to be at work and to reveal needs in the present moment for the social work practitioner. So his work is really important for us to understand that Christian stream as well. So the definition that I offer with understanding the difference between kind of this Buddhist take on suffering and attachment, while also taking into consideration this operational definition offered by Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, is to include this attention-seeking kind of stance, right, the state. So Christian mindfulness is about making time to turn our whole attention to God so that we can hear and abide in his voice above the chatter and stress of our lives. So embedded in this definition is this kind of idea of transcendence, that we are not just relegated to our material, but that there is an embodied kind of a mind, body, and soul engagement when we think about Christian mindfulness, that I think we can argue that Buddhism probably would agree with, but the source of that kind of transcendence we would disagree on. But what's important here is that there's still this idea of right mindfulness, right? We're hearing and abiding in God's voice. That's above, right? That what the Buddhists would say, maybe attachments, we would say the chatter and stress, right? The things that keep us attached to this world, this side of heaven. So again, we can enter into a mindful state or trait through any one of these three areas. We can engage the body, and that body engagement is going to impact our thoughts or our mind, right? We're holistic in terms of how we as human beings are made in the ontology of what we think a human is and who God made us. Not only that, if we nurture the soul and spirit, maybe that would have an impact on our body, and so on and so forth. That this is kind of what I like to call a virtuous cycle, right? Like you can enter at any point. Maybe your thoughts or mind is muddy today, but you can engage your body. And that might be something that's an entry point for mindfulness. Maybe your body and your mind are muddled today, and you can therefore engage in your soul or spirit, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really important, kind of a thesis of my book, that it's mind, body, and spirit. You can engage all three, or you can enter into any one of those. So some of the basic steps of mindfulness in general that I think the secularists or Buddhist mindfulness practitioners, along with us in the Christian contemplative or mystical stream, might be able to agree on, is this idea of activating, right, the parasympathetic system. So first, the easiest way to do that would be to breathe deeply while noticing and observing. So it's not just a physical noticing, it's also a mind engaged noticing. So we activate our parasympathetic system, which we know is kind of the calming centers of our body. Stephen Porges has done a lot of work on this regarding the vagal nerve and the activation of heart rate variability to activate our emotional regulation system. And then we observe our body, mind, and spirit. And then here's where the soul and spirit might enter. We align to what is sacred when we name our values. What are we valuing in life, right? Is it that attachment to stress? Is it the kind of the things of this world? That we name our values in that process. And then we rehearse healthy patterns of thought. And that's an engagement of mind again, where we can say, okay, there is stress and chatter. How do I transcend that for that moment? Easier said than done, right? These are steps to practice, and that's why it's called a practice in mindfulness. Breath is a foundation. Some of the research I did earlier that I leaned on for this book was just a small exploratory study where I did measure heart rate variability based on Stephen Porges's research on what that means for activation. So this is a time you were welcome to join me in this practice, but just to kind of give you that experiential learning. If you want to join me, I'll lead you in a 4-count breath exercise with Christian imagination. That's part of some of the content in my book. And so again, feel free to or not, but if you would like to, I'll begin now, and you can close your eyes if you'd like, or keep them open, whatever is going to sound and feel good to you today. And we're going to start with just activating our breath and understanding that breath is life. And as you think about your breath, and I'm going to count in, so you're going to inhale with me and hold your breath for 4 counts, and then you're going to exhale with me, okay? And then I'll have some more instructions. So let's go ahead and inhale together. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. If you want, you could keep breathing in that rhythm And just for now, just focus on breathing and breath. Notice how your lungs expand. Notice how they deflate at the exhale. Observe your body and just focus your mind just on your breath for now. With each breath, just notice that breath is giving you oxygen and life. And recall in your Christian imagination the story of God breathing into Adam. Imagine that God's breath that breathed into Adam is the same breath that he breathes into you. And take that breath in. And then exhale and receive this breath of God as a gift of life. Receive it as a gift of peace. God said he is the author and perfecter of our faith, and he is, right, the Prince of Peace. So just focus your attention on that breath and some of these thoughts that may resonate with you. If they don't resonate, that's okay. Just go back to breath. But receive the gifts of your breath and God's breath to you today. Just note and observe how you feel in your mind, in your body, in your soul. And take one more deep inhale and out, exhale, and slowly open your eyes and come back to this moment with me. Thank you for trying that out. Sometimes that can be a mindful practice. Sometimes that can be something to do throughout a stressful day. And so those kinds of practices that activate our attention to the body, there's a lot of research on how that helps us in terms of burnout prevention, helps us with wellness, is helpful for resilience, and even things like empathy. Christian meditation is similar. It's a practice itself, but it can elicit a mindfulness state. And that also addresses self-care and supports compassionate response. And then particularly, there's some researchers, Frederick Dunbar and Ty, who really looked at things like Eastern Orthodox traditional practices, such as Jesus Prayer, and then the Jesuit practices of the Examen, that could possibly alleviate burnout amongst pastoral staff. So that was sort of a foundational research that I looked at and leaned on to write a chapter, particularly on pastors and ministry and mindfulness in the book. So also embedded in Christian mindfulness is this idea of a relational nature, that God, if we believe that God is three in one, that he is, Father, Son, Holy Spirit in one. And so that's kind of a model for us, that Christian mindfulness isn't done in isolation, but that God is active in that present moment. And that is something that I think is unique in terms of Christian mindfulness. Here's just some background. I won't go through every little detail on the slide, but the takeaway here is that we are active in God's presence, that the Holy Spirit is at work while we're being mindful. Mindfulness is to be aware, and I think that awareness in the Christian stream is even closer, right? It's even more pronounced because we're aware and there's an external force, so to speak, that speaks into that awareness at that state, at that moment, in that present moment. We're not doing it just on our own. It's not a navel gazing kind of self analysis, but that there's the self and the interaction from the Holy Spirit working. The other parallels as we think about the body and mindfulness is that there's a lot of work. Some of you might have heard this title, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And just in terms of how trauma is stored in the body, there's a lot of parallels to clinical intervention in eating disorders, self-injury and trauma, the use of dialectical behavioral therapy, being able to address these things. Again, that's an intervention in the third wave behaviorist kind of intervention. And what's helpful is thinking about integrating Christian mindfulness into this modality. That's a way that we can ideally incorporate some of that stream into these kind of body identified effective interventions. One example is kind of the body scan exercise that Kabat-Zinn teaches us. And typically that takes about 20 to 30 minutes. I kind of timed it in terms of the book. I have an audio version of the book and it does take a while to get through it. The other exercise that I think is kind of embodied that way is this tea drinking exercise that I detail out in the book, where I hold a mug of tea. And it's a practice of receiving God's grace and a practice of being mindful of his attention as you drink the tea into your body. So, some scriptural support for this idea of embodiment is, not just that it's heart, mind, and soul, but it's also that Christ is incarnate, right? In that. I know this verse doesn't speak directly to the embodied idea, but inherent is in the loving, right? Is the fact that Christ died on the cross, embodied, incarnate, so that we are also to love God in an embodied way and to receive his grace in such a way. And so that's one of the major tenets of my book as well. So I think I already went through this slide. I apologize for that. So also, let me shift to kind of this idea of the mind. Here's some scriptural support for mindfulness in the mind. And so activating the mind, obviously, the most prevalent kind of intervention would be CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really focused on thoughts and ideally reframing distorted thoughts. And this idea of this biblical concept of taking every thought captive. We observe our thoughts in mindfulness. We attend to those thoughts. We look at precursors to those thoughts and beliefs surrounding them and the consequences. And then we also, in Christian mindfulness, allow this meta kind of analysis of our thoughts, right? How do we think about our thoughts, not just in light of our present circumstances, but in light of the Holy Spirit, in light of teaching and scripture? I think it's an opportunity, again, for faith integration, spiritual formation in that kind of what would normally be a very mind-driven intervention. We can activate the soul. We can ask God in relationship to make us more aware of where our thoughts are rooted. So again, in the mind, when we think about DBT, there's this idea of the wise mind, the sound mind, and the reactive and emotional mind, and that in that dialectic between the two, that there's opposites at work. This DBT has a very much a Buddhist sort of framework, or actually I would even argue a Taoist framework of looking at the third way. What is a third way where we can hold two opposites together? And I think that is not outside of our Christian mindfulness integration. I think that's very much in line with how we can think about, our wise mind being activated in this presence of God, right? And then our reactive mind and finding that balance. That doesn't mean we negate reactive mind, and it also doesn't mean that we intellectualize things that are emotional, but wise mind incorporates both emotion and intellect together. And so again, that in Christian mindfulness, that we are transcending kind of those present moment experiences, but we aren't called to be unemotional in the mind, that we are still body, mind, and spirit, that all three can work together. So it's to help, I think it's a lot to break down in just a few minutes, but all to say that this paradoxical understanding of truth is can be useful for clients who are struggling with, right here, I feel all these emotions, and yet I know that, I can't act out in certain ways that might be unhealthy or toxic to my mental health. So how can I find the truth there? I think Christian mindfulness with awareness and attention and present moment understanding can help us get there. The Lord's Prayer is one such way. I think there's some kind of paradoxical understanding there, especially as we think about forgiveness. So I have a chapter in the book about forgiveness and kind of that paradoxical. I receive forgiveness and I have to forgive, right? And so one of the ways that I incorporate even spiritual formation practices into kind of this mind activated idea of Christian mindfulness is through the Lord's Prayer. And Lectio Divina, simply for those of us who are unfamiliar, it's just reading God's word slowly and being able to say it out loud, being able to contemplate each verse. And so a big portion about the first part of actually this part 2 of the book is breaking down each verse of the Lord's Prayer and providing some good exercises that are incorporated from Christian mindfulness through those steps. Again, in terms of DBT, this is just kind of some thoughts. I won't go through it all, but again, just this idea of that faith does not just equal thoughts and beliefs, right? That we really have an idea of understanding, right, emotion, understanding faith in that emotion, and understanding kind of right mindfulness thoughts that might be helpful for us to move our clients forward in Christian mindfulness. I won't read those verses for the sake of time, but I look to this as kind of a good example of how DBT can live, Christian mindfulness infused with DBT, can live in that third space. Mindfulness in the soul, obviously, is really breaking down kind of this idea that there is a good outcome, right? There's something that's the goodness of Christ for our soul in mindfulness. And so here's some scriptural support for that, that Christian mindfulness is really not about, right, like the Buddhists would say, enlightenment, but it's really about intimacy with our Lord, understanding of how God is at work and moving amongst us, not only in the individual, but also the community. Again, faith is engaged when we can seek God's wisdom and forgiveness. And there's a lot of work on, some of these concepts of prayer and letting go, forgiveness, ethical decision-making, and practicing self-care via mindfulness. And so some of that work, this is kind of more secular research on some of these concepts in mindfulness, but I also argue in the book that Christian mindfulness particularly is well suited to prayer practices, letting go, forgiveness, ethical decision-making, and practicing self-care. These are part and parcel of how we would look at Christian mindfulness from the mystical and contemplative stream to be able to help us in these kinds of behaviors or attitudes in general. Again, more work on how mindfulness can facilitate forgiveness, again, in the secular research. But again, Christian mindfulness, right, is really rooted in this idea of forgiveness. So a quick example, again, is a Jesus prayer. The Orthodox believers in our communities would often pray this prayer: Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This idea, and they repeat this over and over and over again, to the point where it's a meditation, but it's also a truth, right, for the soul. that sinks in over time. And even just praying this over and over, I think if you concentrate on those words, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, there is a shift that begins to take place where and a mental space and a present moment orientation that opens up mind, body, and soul to this kind of truth. And so Christian mindfulness is really not just a balm for our thoughts in stress, but also a balm for our souls. When we are in need of forgiveness, when we need to be able to practice forgiveness, I think this Orthodox prayer is something that could teach us a lot, especially in our evangelical tradition. We're not as familiar. So I talk a little bit about that in my book as well, how we can look to kind of the ancients to help us with some of this state of mindfulness. Again, I keep saying it, but I think it's really important. Self-care, burnout prevention. I think there's also a soul issue when we talk about burnout. There might be moral dilemmas. I think we're in a state where that's more prominent, right? During COVID, there's been a lot of moral concerns, maybe, for instance, rationing care, healthcare workers who are in the midst of some of these, issues. Burnout is not just physical, burnout is also soul. And so I wrote an article a long time ago that I lean on a little bit when we think about ethical decision making, especially in social work practice, where I think Christian mindfulness can help us clarify our ethics and clarify so that, in some sense, I would argue, could also prevent soul burnout. The more that we are aware of our ethics and our values, again, any mindfulness practice, like I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, is going to name values, right? They're all going to name it. And so for us in the Christian stream, naming of those values hopefully is aligned with what God is calling us to do in our integrity. Centering prayer is an exercise that I think can be really useful in terms of that soul work. That kind of prayer is not a prayer of supplication. It's based on Thomas Keating's work about setting an intention with God and listening. It's a stance of listening and spending time with God and hearing and abiding his voice, not God, I need this. God, help me with this. It's God, what do I need? You know better than I. And so I think that can be really helpful as we think about soul care, soul burnout prevention, soul-based ethical decision-making. And also when we engage a soul, I think we engage with something that is really real. We determine what is of God, what is his value system over what our vision is for ourselves, our work. We kind of have to take a step back, right? And hear from God, what is it that he is calling each of us collectively and individually to do and to be and to act and to think and to live. And so I think some of the thing I try to highlight in this book as well is to get out of what I would call scarcity thinking and really look at kind of the abundance of God and what how gentle he is with us, that, he tells us, right, to take his yoke upon us and learn from him and to be gentle and humble in our hearts so that we'll find rest. And so centering prayer, I think, is a great avenue to do that, to practice that, to find that rest. And Christian mindfulness, obviously, that mindfulness state, as we can, even as I speak, thinking about, gosh, take this from me, God, help me, let me lean into that abundance, I think can give us some actual tangible feelings of rest for our souls. I have an exercise in the book of progressive muscle relaxation. Again, this embodied work that we do especially in the counseling fields, social work, clinical fields, psychology fields, this kind of exercise really does activate that system. And then I pair that with a Christian mindfulness exercise and imagination of God's presence in that as we move through the body through that. I think we can also use that in conjunction with a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy model. And so it's this idea, right, like that we can contain a healing space in our bodies, in our souls, and our minds with Christ at the center. We can expose ourselves to some of the trauma of, the past memories in that healing space. And so there's a lot of work that preceded kind of this Christian mindfulness stream. Again, Sung Young Tan, who's done some work on this on inner healing prayer work. I would say that kind of the evolution of inner healing prayer work to Christian mindfulness, there's a thread there, but Christian mindfulness is a little bit more researched and evidence informed because it can be integrated into third wave. But anyways, what I want to say in terms of this is, that we in Christian mindfulness, we start where the client is. We evaluate readiness before we do anything, and that any type of soul work that we do needs to be obviously in that gentle spirit and in that client's voluntary volition. So I speak about that in the book as well, how important that consent is for the client, how important it is to evaluate at each step whether we are inviting God in that space, voluntary or involuntary. And that's really important for clients to have that free will, right? And so lastly, what I want to say about kind of Christian mindfulness in general, it's not just individual, that it's community. So I have some practices in the book as well, where it's really talking about having a community mindedness, that mindfulness is an original root, especially as we think about Buddhism, is always practiced in a sangha, in a community, that it's very rare that it's done individualistically. My critique of John Kabat-Zinn's work is that it's very individualistic and Western. So it has a flavor to that, where other people have critiqued it as being very self-absorbed and navel-gazing. I would say that's maybe slightly unfair, but the antidote to that would be to bring Christian mindfulness into and to look at whether it is more effective in community. So some of the steps that I've taken actually, which I'll end on, is to think about mindfulness from the pastor's point of view, because I do see pastors as kind of community leaders in the Christian space. And so the research I've started with pastors is to ask them about mindfulness and what they think about Christian mindfulness. There's a lot of, I'll be honest, resistance to that term because of Buddhism, but helping to unpack, right? What do we mean by mindfulness in the Christian stream? So this is a table, it's kind of a preview of a article in press right now that will come out soon about all the different exemplars of these pastors, who actually the majority of the pastors I interviewed for this study were persons of color. And so these are the people that they have been exposed to, they look to in terms of kind of being theological and historical exemplars of Christian mindfulness. So if you can't read it all there, don't worry, the article is going to come out. So I encourage you to look at that later. But I wanted to share, sorry, there should be another, here it is. This is the citation that will come out in a few months. But the other thing that I found in that study were these themes that Christian mindfulness practice was used by pastors, and they did experience a deep abiding with God, which then outflowed to others. There's that community thing, that it wasn't just for them, it was to serve their community. Secondly, it also helped them with stress management. There's a lot of conflict talk in that management, and improves their sense of self, meaning, and purpose. And that lastly, Christian mindfulness gently revealed emotional truths that really, again, help them, right? That's that truth serum, I would say, like when you spend time with God, with your thoughts, maybe some of those thoughts aren't accurate. And so they were able to see some of those emotional truths, again, that dialectic. It's not just an intellectual truth, it's also an emotional and soul-driven truth. And that helped improve their outlook in the midst of challenge. So yeah, so that I drew from some of the initial findings to, like I said, the chapter in the book about pastors and mindfulness. And that's kind of a research agenda I'm moving forward afterwards. This is we don't have time for this, but a practice that you can use, a simple tea drinking exercise. It gives you an idea. Louise, with your mugs, it's great. And just notice, right, as you breathe in and out, take in the aroma, allow God's peace and nourishment to seep into your system, right, into your mind, body, and soul. And that's in the book that I start out, I think in chapter 1 with this tea drinking exercise. So that's it for me. If you have any questions, this is a link that you can find the book. There's also audio version if you'd like. And let me stop sharing and I'll take questions or comments, please.
Just go ahead and unmute and ask your question. As people are gathering their thoughts, I'll ask a question. Right at the beginning, you mentioned that this was the third wave of behaviorist models. How would you what are examples of the first two waves? Is that the secular and Buddhist?
No, so first wave behaviorism is simply kind of like Pavlovian response, right? Behavior, reward. Second wave is cognitive behavioral therapy. So we pair behavior, reward with our thoughts, and we reinforce and reframe our thoughts as sort of a system of reward or punishment. We don't use those terms, punishment, in our fields, right? But that would be it. I do talk about that in the book. I break down what first wave, second wave, and third wave is. The third wave has generally been more popular. I would say where I started seeing this conversation was around 2005. And when third wave was started, Marsha Linehan is a big part of that work for third wave. And so she would be considered an exemplar of that. So Beck would be, kind of, you could argue first or second wave for him. But, and then Albert Ellis, I think his work in previous waves is really important, as well as I would say, who's David Burns on the lay level. He's so popular for CBT. He wrote a book that's very, very well known. And I would call that second wave. That's general. I'm not just calling that. The disciplines are calling that. Did I miss anything, Samuel? I'm going to lean on you on that. Did I get that? Okay. Okay, good. We share that with psychology.
I will jump in, Regina. Excellent sabbatical talk. And I really do look forward to reviewing the book and even incorporating it into our PsyD program. I'm really curious about, and you may go into this much more in the book, but I'm really curious about this sort of idea of the ways that Christian mindfulness are different from definitely the secularized, watered down John Kabat-Zinn stuff, which is good, but and then definitely very different from the Buddhist psychologies. But like, how far back were you able to go when we think about like the Desert Fathers, when we think about, you mentioned mysticism, you mentioned contemplatives, not to turn this into a church history class, but I'm really interested. How far back did you find things that we would call mindfulness?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Eastern Orthodox tradition, that predates the Reformation, right? I mean, the Filiocalia has a lot in there that I would consider mindfulness, right? The Desert Fathers, the Cloud of Unknowing, and then I would just say, that those are ancient. Those things are really ancient. So, right, what is that? I mean, 3rd century, some of this, 4th century. I don't know, Liz, I'm going to lean on the centuries with you. I do break that down in the chapters. There are some there, like you said, it is broken down in terms of, I don't have that top of mind right now, what centuries those are, but it does. I mean, I was reading the Philokalia and I was really struck by that.
Benedict of Nursia would be a good one. He's 600s. So another good one to look at.
Great question. Thank you, Samuel. Louise.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, Regina. Maybe because of my training in science, I'm thinking about data and assessment and effectiveness. So as mentioned, some others mentioned that Buddhism and Christianity have similarities and differences, especially regarding mindfulness and the approach and practice of mindfulness. So I wonder if there's any work being done on evaluating the effectiveness of the different approaches. And for example, you mentioned ethical decision-making that would kind of help or prevent burnout. So I wonder the different approaches from the two different religions. Is there any indication of which would be effective towards what component, whatnot?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Louise. It's what you're getting at. What I'm hearing is kind of what is that change mechanism, right? In Buddhist thought versus Christian thought. And has anyone been able to kind of compare? I will say that's a very challenging concept to take a look at what those kind of religious underpinnings change mechanism. I will say, I haven't seen a study that compared Christian versus Buddhism. We're all kind of working in isolation. So some people are doing Buddhist mindfulness and some people are doing Christian mindfulness. The work I've done is just to show, hey, Christian mindfulness is as effective. The outcomes that are being studied in Buddhist or secular mindfulness, I think we can replicate that in the Christian stream. So this is very new. I wouldn't say my studies are exhaustive. My ends are generally around, like if it's self-report, I have I think my biggest N was 80. So there's a lot of, but I did have a good effect size. On the HRV, that's why I started using HRV, because I think it's a biometric that has some potential. But again, the effectiveness is just as effective. But side by side, I think that's going to be really challenging. I would guess that you're not going to see a big difference of effectiveness. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How did you connect with John Trent on this?
I went to Malibu.
Really? Through
Yeah.
one of his visits to the writers' retreats?
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
did he have experience or expertise in mindfulness?
No.
Okay.
No. But he was curious and he was I really looked to him, to be honest, kind of to mentor me through this. As you all know, he's good at book publishing. Just even I'm learning from him, like, how do you market a book? How do you think about, he's kind of mentored me through that process, to be honest. So,
and how do you organize ideas and
right.
Yeah,
right.
that's been his real strength. Okay, that's actually interesting to know.
Yeah, that book proposal that I told you, that was 60 pages.
Yeah.
That was a result of some of his feedback in terms of making sure, because I'll just say in the evangelical, especially the white evangelical space, mindfulness is a very touchy, kind of skeptical term. And so having his guidance on that was really key. And his support of this book was really key because he speaks into that space really well.
Any quick last question?
I think we should have Regina come to departmental meeting in the beginning and help us, with the practices and exercises. Maybe faculty senate too.
The faculty say yes. We all need it. Hey, research is me search. I need it. I need mindfulness.
Maybe this is a question for Sam and others, but how does you use the word emotion interspersed with mind, body, and spirit? How does it fit in? Is it fit into the spirit? It seemed like a fourth leg there.
Is this for me or for others? Sorry.
Well, yeah, for you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see emotion just seated in the body. I don't see emotion seated in the mind. I think this is my ontology, like, right? Like we are mind, body, and spirit. So emotion is not just seated in one, it's all three of those. You can be, let me give you an example. If you didn't eat breakfast and you just had coffee, you're going to feel stressed and anxious. Maybe sometimes people feel anxious if they didn't do their, spend time with God. And obviously maybe you had a stressful day at work and you felt anxious. So I think it could, that emotion can enter into
All
your,
three.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, hey, Regina, thanks very much for really interesting, stimulating talk.
Thank you.
And on behalf of my office, I just let you know that we'll make a small gift to an upcoming pay period for you of $100. So when you see that, it's not permanent. It's not that you got a raise, but you got a little boost there. So
Thanks for the boost.
just a token of appreciation for your good work in preparing this presentation and providing it to us. And okay, thanks very much.
Thanks for
And
your,
be sure to be on the lookout for if you want to see Regina's talk on the YouTube channel. It kind of lives longer then. Okay, thanks again. All right. Thanks everybody for coming out. All right.